Thank you for that. Okay, cool. Now we're recording. Welcome everyone to Software Saturdays Week 1, HTML and CSS. So before we begin, a quick show of hands. Who here has any experience with HTML or CSS or anything like that at all? If you don't, that's perfectly fine. No one? That's perfect. That's what we want to see. Come on, Zoom. There we go. So as a quick review of what we're going to be covering this week, or this program, it's going to be 5 lessons and then 2 project work days. So today's HTML and CSS. So next week will be JavaScript and then JSX, more React, and then finally some APIs and React. If a lot of these words seem unfamiliar to you, that's fine. That's the whole point of this course. It's going to teach you the vocabulary and the actual what they mean behind it as well. And so everyone could be able to learn and build a pretty cool looking web app by the end of the course to this semester here. So in case you want to figure out how to get more help, obviously you have these learning sessions, 2 hours every Saturday. I do record them. Thank you, Dad, for reminding me today. But they will go up tonight or probably tomorrow night when I have some more time on YouTube, and I'll put a link in the Brightspace page as well. You guys can review that recording as many times as you guys choose to kind of refresh your memory or practice some more or whatever you have. And if you want to go for this, some more personalized review hours, we are hosting like an office hour drop-in style review. Okay. I'm not sure what that is. Sorry. That will be on Wednesdays, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. over Zoom. The link for that will be posted on Brightspace probably tonight or tomorrow. So you can just hop in for as little as you need to kind of review the concepts. Typically, people drop in more towards the end of the semester, closer to like, your week 5, your project day, the things that are more complicated. But if you need to hop in now, please, the more you get help, the sooner you get help this early, the better off you'll be in a few weeks from now when these all kind of build upon one another. Then of course, Slack, we're always on Slack, or on Brightspace as well. Just send me an email, send me a Slack message, and we'll make sure to help everyone out, no problems. Okay, teaching staff. Obviously, I'm Hadi. I'm the chair for the info session. John over here will be assisting me this year in the beginner track. And then in the intermediate track, Sam and Nishant, they're not going to be here too often, but they're there in case you want to ask them for help as well. So all of us are pretty experienced with this, this topic here. We're all really wanting to help everyone learn all they can from this program. Is the whole point of what teaching everyone here. Okay, first of all, is everyone here on Brightspace? Just want to make it. I know one person isn't, so I got their email. But if you're not, send me an email, emma138@purdue.edu, and I will make sure that you are added today. Join Slack as well. You don't have to, but I recommend it for these discussions. It's mostly more of a question platform than anything else, but it's just pretty good. Always good to have more help options available to you. And before we begin, this is more of a general kind of course-wide thing. Don't have to do it right now, but just think about this. You will need a text editor for this course. What that really means is when we're editing code files, we have to use a special program to edit them properly. Because like a typical, your Word won't actually open or actually edit code files if you're familiar with that at all. I highly recommend Visual Studio Code or VS Code. It is probably one of my favorite IDEs or text editors out there. Here's a link to download it right here. But obviously, whatever you want to use is A-OK. VS Code is an option. You got Sublime Text. You got Notepad++, regular Notepad. You want to go hardcore Vim, CS159 style. Whatever you want to do is A-OK with me, as long as you have some way to edit plain text code files. And then if you want to follow on with the code that we're presenting in class today or in the future, our GitHub is where we find all our examples. So all you have to do is go to the link, it's on Brightspace as well. Click on the link here. Thank you for letting me know. And then if you look here, there's our repo. The way we do our repo is a little bit different. If you're familiar with the branches in Git, we basically use Git branches for everything. If not, there's a little drop down in the top corner here. We'll have the word master in it at first. Change it from master to whatever lesson number you want to review, lesson 1 in this case. And you will see all the demo code that we're talking about in class right there for everyone here kind of to discuss more or less. Does that make sense? Cool. And what we will do is after each week ends, we will publish some examples of the checkpoint codes. So you guys can have more code to look at and practice and review inside your lessons. Yeah, so it's going to be a link on the Google, it's going to be a link on Brightspace and a link on the slides here. I believe you're on Brightspace. I can't actually show you Brightspace really well. Where is Hampton? Oh, yeah, Miller, I'm sorry, I got the message there. It's Hampton 1144. I'm not sure if you're still in the call or not, but yeah, they might have forgot to type a 4 somewhere in the message. I think you guys. My apologies. So much going on there. No, it's a private message to me. Yeah. Yeah, it should be linked on Brightspace. Like this should be code examples, and then it also on the slides as well. So there are 2 ways to get to it. It's really your choice how you want to find it. And this is for next week, so we'll skip this part now, but we will need to install npm and node in the future. So if you want to do it now, go ahead. If not, you can wait till week 3, no problem. Okay, time to get the actual content of the course here, which is HTML. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, HTML. And really it has the idea of tags that can represent an element on a website. And then we can kind of nest and kind of order these tags in very interesting ways to make everything in the web you see nowadays. The way it works is every tag, we call a tag in HTML, has both an opening and a close, using these 2 symbols with the angle brackets you see on screen here. And if you can nest these tags in a cool way, you can make, again, any website you can think of is made of nothing but these tags. So you just use HTML to describe stuff like the location, some basic styling, and the content of the web page, like text, images, videos, links, what have you, lists even. And you can use CSS, which we'll talk about in a few slides from now, to add things like font sizing, colors, borders, margins, padding, backgrounds, you name it. Basically, HTML is kind of your plain text, kind of boring output. And then CSS kind of style it to make it look nice. You can add all your fancy aesthetic stuff to it using both. And then finally, we can use JavaScript to make it more user interactive. What that really means is making the things more dynamic, making things react to you, because regular HTML is very static, meaning once you display it, it's there forever. But with JavaScript, we can make it change using a framework like React. So a basic HTML page will look something like this. The very top line number 1 here, the doc type HTML, defines a blank HTML document. You have to include this. The caps don't matter, but the actual content does. This tells the browser the document we're about to receive, render, is actually HTML. This is more of a convention than a requirement. Most modern browsers will do just fine without this tag on there, but it's always better to make sure your code is as good as possible. So always have this at the very top of your HTML file. Next is the opening HTML tag. So if you see, just very briefly here, the idea of tags, right? The first and the bottom line have the same tag name, right? Surrounded by angle brackets, with the closing tag or the ending tag having a slash before the name. That's how you kind of describe tags and how you describe things in HTML. So really line 2 is saying I'm opening an HTML document, and then line 7 is saying I'm closing the document out. And in between the opening and closing tags, you can lay out more tags. For example, in this snippet of code, we have 2, the head and the body. The head, again, you can see opening and slash the closing, and same with the body. In the HTML, in the world, the head part of your HTML page will mostly be used for browser information, like the title of your page, other sites to load, maybe who the author of your sites, with a short keyword description, stuff that the user will never actually see or interact with, but the browser and Google and other kind of engines need to kind of help properly index and search your page for everyone else to see properly on the web nowadays. However, the part we care about most in this course is the body section. As the name suggests, body is like the meat of your actual HTML document. And what that means, it describes the entire layout. Within the body tag, you will describe your entire layout of your site. And that is exactly what the user will see. So if you think about it, head is browser, meaning the user never sees it. Body is layout. The user will always see stuff in the body tags. Wait, one more thing. The lines here is kind of showing you guys that tags have opening and closing, and you can nest tags, meaning you can put tags within other tags. As you can see, the head and the body are nested within the HTML tag. Any questions so far? We feeling good about this? Cool. So here's a really basic HTML text. You have div, right? You have, which is kind of like an invisible group of other tags. Div is kind of short for something, I'm not sure exactly what, but really it's meant for kind of making kind of sections on your page, like a divider, almost, I think about it that way. H and then a number is to be a heading text. So H1 is very big, large, like title. H2 be a bit smaller, H3 a bit smaller than that, all the way to H6, which is the most smallest text you could possibly make for a heading. These are great for, like, you know, titles, subsection headings, you know, article headings, whatever you want to call it. But if you want like regular paragraph text, the P tag is your friend here. P for paragraph is the typical plain old text block. And any text is going to be basically wrapped in a P tag. And if the cool thing about P tags is if you have if you put each P on a block of text, it'll automatically add like spacing to make the text look, you know, like a physical like paragraph in an essay, for example. Was it really? Huh, the more you know. Some more quick tags: UL, OL, and LI. UL and OL are ordered lists and unordered lists. As the name suggests, ordered lists are like numbers, like, you know, 1, 2, 3. Unordered are like bullet point lists, you know, this regular old checklist, you know, like a checklist of sorts. And then within those two kinds of list items, you can have LI, or list item, or list text, as I prefer to call it, which you will nest each bullet or each numbering as one LI. So you can think about it, you can go UL, LI, text, close the LI, open an LI, some more text, close it, and then finally close the UL. And then the same for the OL. Some of the names are kind of short acronyms, right? Because the thing we have to remember is these all require data and bytes to store this information on a document and send it over the internet. And so we want to make sure that our pages are as condensed as possible so that we're not wasting bandwidth or storage space for both our users and for our own servers in the cloud or wherever. And so oftentimes we use kind of weird acronyms or kind of shorthands to represent most things so that it's easier to translate properly. So if you don't know what something means, look it up. There's a bazillion guides for HTML on the web, and it should be pretty easy to figure out what something's trying to say. So let's go to a quick demo program here. I can't actually hide this, so let's move the bottom of my screen here. So I'm going to go to the lesson 1 demo and download all this code from the GitHub, the zip file here. That's what I recommend you do, unless you like to use Git, which if you do, good on you. But if not, don't worry about too much. I'm going to extract all this code into just forward, it looks good. And I'm going to open this up in a note editor called Notepad++. So we're going to open this up, open folder as a workspace, downloads, and this. Okay. Here is our demo1.html document. So as you can see, it's a pretty basic document, looks very simple, but has all the tags that we were talking about earlier today in today's slides. You can see how in the body tag, we nest a whole bunch of other tags. You know, our P tags, our H1 or H3s, the divs, the list items, everything. And then in between the opening and closing tags, we can put text for the user to visibly see. And if you want to know how to do comments, well, comments are a bit special. You can see on the top here, you do comments with this notation. It's a bit weirder than other languages, but that's just how the HTML spec designers, what this, you know, 40 years ago, 30 years ago now, when the spec was first created. So the user won't see the comments, but the programmers can, so they're pretty useful. Now, if you want to display this, all we have to do is go to our, I can't see this very well. There we go. Go to our here, and to open up an HTML document in your web browser to view, you navigate to it in your folder, like here, find it, like here, and then double click it. Windows should automatically open it up in your browser of choice, in my case, Edge. So let's take a look. Well, if you pull up our code, that's like a side-by-side comparison. The first thing we should see is a big text H1 that says big demo 1. And then some smaller text for smaller demo 1. And then finally some paragraph just saying something random. And as you can see, that is exactly what we see in our HTML document that is displayed to the user, right? Big text, smaller text, regular old plain text, you know, normal text, you might call it. And then finally, we have both an ordered list and an unordered list, or vice versa here actually. Bullets and numberings. Does everyone see how we can make kind of basic pages using those 4 or 5 tags? And what do you know here? Keep this in mind. If we go back to our code, I do not mind download an update. This div tag, right? The div tag is there, but if you look on screen, you have no way to tell that a div tag, because divs are invisible to the user and solely used by the programmers to make their pages more, divisible, making means that you can style a block individually, or maybe have it be easier to understand when you're programming it, but not when you're displaying it. So divs, again, are completely invisible unless you choose to make them less visible, which is very uncommon. Any questions with demo 1? Cool, sounds good. So there are a lot of HTML tags you can talk about. Here are a couple more that are very commonly used in most modern pages nowadays. You have image tags, buttons, BR line breaks, and A, or anchor or link tags. IMG or image tags, as the name suggests, are used for images, right? IMG image, pretty explanatory. Buttons add buttons. Again, the name is pretty good about describing what it does. And you can put text in between the opening and the closing text, these tags for the word button, to create the text for your button. Next, you have BR or line break tags. This is for adding space between elements, like a vertical space, like a line break, without having to actually put text or paragraph tag in the middle there. Then finally, this is probably the worst name out of all they could chosen, but A. A here means link to another site, like a URL to another site. Why they chose A, I have no idea. But that's the name they chose, and that's the name we have to use forevermore nowadays in the actual world. But just keep in mind, A here means like a link to another page. Don't be surprised, because there's also a link tag, which means something completely different. So just be careful when it comes to that in the future. So the head part. In this class, we won't cover the head part of the HTML spec too much, but there are a few things to note that we should probably implement to make our page better for everyone to use. The only 2 tags you will ever have to deal with from the head section are going to be these 2, title and link. Again, be careful here. Link does not mean like a URL link. It means link CSS or JS, resource file link. So it's kind of confusing, keep that in mind. But title is, the name is a bit more clear there. It is the title of the web page. So in the browser, right, the top tab, but you have a title up in the title in the top tab there, that is defined using the title tag in the head section of the HTML site. That is all we care about. Anything else that would go in here, we will give you guys, since a lot of these tags are really not meant to be user readable, but more for the machines that don't understand properly. Now, it's a bit tricky part about attributes. So tags are cool, pretty easy to understand at all, pretty great. But there is a lot more you can do with HTML, right? For example, images, right? How do you tell the browser which image to display properly to the user? How big going to be the image? That's where HTML attributes come in. Attributes allow us to provide other information to the browser that we can control the behavior of the display of the elements. They're always defined in the opening tag, not the closing tag, the opening tag. And they have the form right there, where the tag comes first, then your name of the attribute equals, in quotes, the value. So think about it like a bunch of like key value pairs using equal signs and quotes to properly define them in the actual opening tag. So what are attributes? One of the most common is href, or hypertext reference. And this one is pretty much only used with link tags. Again, or anchor or A tag, as the actual spec calls them. So in there, you say href equals, in quotes, the link you want to go to, right? So in this case, we want to, when you click on this link, take you to this URL, but the user will be displayed whatever text is inside the A of the anchor tag. That's you can have like a click here link that takes you somewhere else in the web. Oh, one more thing to note, be careful with this. It's a very common mistake. If you want to link to a different website, like say Google or I don't know, somewhere else, make sure you put the HTTPS:// before it in the href part of the attribute here. If you don't, what might happen is the browser will try to find that document, that URL from within your document, which will break a whole lot of things and will not work properly. So make sure you always put the HTTPS:// if you're trying to navigate to a different site away from your current site. And you'll see what I'm talking about in demo number 2. The last couple ones, there's 4 here that we care about, but 2 on the actual slide. There's source and alt, also height and width. Source, or SRC, is source, short for source. It's a very common programming acronym there. Specifies the location of an external resource that is embedded at the object location. What that means is, where can the browser find the image to display? So you can see our image tag here, we're looking for the street.jpg image in our current server, and we want to display it to the user. Alt is a way to describe the image in like text. So in case the element of the image cannot load, it'll display the alt text instead. It is important to always use alt text on your images for 2 reasons. 1, if your user on the website is visually impaired, a screen reader can actually use the alt text to instead read what the image is to the visually impaired user of your site, making sure that everyone can use your site properly. Second is, if a user has a poor network, bad internet, the browser can choose to instead load the alt text instead of the image, saving the user bandwidth. So for that reason, always put in alt text and describe your image in the alt text, so that any user can always use your site properly. The final 2, height and width, are pretty explanatory. The height and the width of the image, and the value is how many pixels or px you want your image to be displayed as. So this image is going to be 500 by 600 pixels. One thing to be careful about, again, is HTML and the browsers do not care what aspect ratio your image is supposed to be. So if your image is actually 500 by 700 pixels, the browser will squish your image to make it fit in that box. So before you put width and height attributes on your image tag, make sure you first know how big the image actually should be when you scale it up or down, because the browser will deform it to make it fit the box properly. So let's see an example of all of these kind of attributes and tags in real life. So we'll look at demo number 2. All right, so we can see here the head tag now is no longer empty. We have a title, lesson 1, demo 2. Moving on in the future, I will always make sure I put the lesson and demo number in the title. If you have multiple code files open from our course, you can always tell what course or where they came from in terms of the actual course. Now, in the body section of this giant page here, we have our typical, H1, H3, and we now have this image tag. So we have, as you can see, SRC, which is the source image, right? To this JPEG file I have right here. The alt image, again, is displayed instead of the image. And finally, the title. The title is very optional. It's more like if you hover over the image, hold the image there instead. It's not important. Don't worry about too much. Can anyone notice a potential problem with this image tag? Yes.
The actual file.
Exactly. Yeah, if you look at it here, I have it named in the code as IEEE_ss.jpg. But if you look on the left-hand side, the actual file is called IEEE_swsat.jpg. What will happen here is the browser will be unable to find that image and will instead load the alt text because it can't find the image. So it's another reason to have the alt text. If you maybe change a file name and the browser, it breaks a link somewhere, the browser can still display something to the user instead. So we also have a p tag with a link in the middle of it right here. And you can see how in the link we have our href with the URL we are going to, right? Which is going to be the IEEE website. Then finally, we have a button, just a regular old button, just a clickable button. And then in this gigantic paragraph, we will have a break tag. One thing to note is HTML will combine multiple white space, meaning tabs, new lines, or just the spaces into a single space, no matter how many you put in there. That's just the way it works. I can't say why, but to make sure you can have like line breaks properly, use break tags. So for example, in this p tag, even though there are 1, 2, 3, 4 new lines, we will only see the one from the break tag here. So if you want to kind of break up text, make sure you actually put the break tag to physically make a line break or end the line, more or less. All right, let's take a look at this program now. So we open it up in our browser. First thing to note, the image broke, right? So the image can't be loaded. So it's going to instead load the alt text, which is going to be here, the logo. Then have our text. See, we have a line break here. Even though we had 4 enters worth of space, we only see 1 new line. That's because, again, HTML will kind of destroy all the rest of it into a single line for making it look nicer to the user or something like that. A button, pretty standard, doesn't do anything, but here's a button. And finally, here's a link to another site. Software Saturday's homepage. So let's look at how we can actually make the image load properly, right? We change this to Software Saturday, save that, and go back to Edge and refresh the page here. Now, because the image file path is valid, we actually load the image, as you can see right here, meaning the user can now see our image in the full glory of our logo. And also, the link works perfectly fine, right? We click on it, we go here, no problem. But if we remove the HTTPS from the link, what's going to happen? We refresh the page, we click on it, and we can't find it. But look at the URL. It's really weird, right? If you don't put the HTTPS before it, what your browser will try to do is find a file called the URL, which is most likely never going to exist in most modern systems. So make sure you have the HTTPS before that. Because now, if we go back and give it a quick refresh, the link works just fine. Any questions with that? Cool. And again, if you're online, just put any questions in the chat or say them out loud, and I will be sure I can get to them as well. All right. That is the basics of HTML. There's a lot more you can cover, but really HTML is quite simple. And all you will have to use for your final project and for most web development can be covered with those like 20 slides or so. So it may seem difficult and confusing at first, but trust me, it'll be pretty simple by the end of it today. So before we move forward, we have a checkpoint to make sure everyone can understand HTML and can properly make HTML. Your checkpoint number 1 is to make a very simple page with a list of tasks or list of things to do. Each task should have both a text and a link somewhere else. And at least one of your tasks should have an image embedded somewhere inside of it. Okay, part number 2, CSS. So I mentioned CSS a couple times now, but what is it really? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's basically a way for us to format and describe and style HTML tags in a very easy to understand manner. It makes formatting extremely simple and very easy to read, and is ubiquitous and used on every site nowadays. If you remember back, right, to our demo 1 and 2, the CSS was pretty boring, pretty basic, pretty generic, but this CSS makes it a lot nicer, a lot easier to look at. How do we use it? Basically, you had to first define a group of similar tags, and then you can give each tag some styling instructions. So these groups can be first a little aside here, classes and IDs. So there are 2 kind of words to kind of think about. Classes and IDs are used all the time in both CSS for styling and also JavaScript for basically everything else we're going to talk about this course. And that is IDs and classes. So IDs are a unique name given to a single element. And like the name ID suggests, only a single element can have that particular ID in that page. People get confused. You can have multiple IDs shared across different pages. But in a single, like, one HTML file, only one element can have one ID. You're going to have multiple IDs, but they must be unique compared to each other. On the other hand, classes are used to identify groups of elements. And these elements are all kind of grouped together into one class, right? The name class kind of represents multiple things. So how you define it, you can see on the two example snippets of code on the bottom here. For an ID, it's an attribute, so you just go ID equal, then the ID name in quotes, and then class equal the class name in quotes. If you look on the class side, on the right-hand side, you can see that both the div tag and the h1 above it both have the same class name of class1. Whereas on the left-hand side with the IDs, h1 has an ID of ID1 and div has an ID of ID2. These names, the ID and class names, can be whatever makes the most sense for your website. We came up with a very basic example here, but choose a name that makes sense and you'll remember what it means when coding, a year or a couple of weeks from now. If you don't, you're in for a very bad day. Now, you can also have an element with both a class and an ID. You'll see an example of that in our demo, but these are not exclusively mutual. You can have, for example, this h2 tag could have both a class and an ID, but as long as the ID is unique to every other ID on the entire, again, one file. But you can share these across files, that's A-OK. So back to CSS for a little bit. There are three ways to group HTML tags into CSS styling groups. There are tag groups, class groups, and ID groups. Now, you can kind of guess what they mean by the name alone, but basically a tag group represents all HTML tags of that tag name. Classes are all HTML elements with that specific class name, and ID is that specific HTML element with that specific ID. And like I mentioned, right, HTML elements can belong to multiple CSS groups. Maybe you define a tag group and a class group and an ID group and assign those three values to one specific element. That's perfectly fine, actually very commonly used, since you maybe want to style things in very particular manners using these sorts of rules. So syntactically, you can import CSS using a link tag. Be careful, this is not an A tag, it's a link tag. So a link tag is how we reference CSS, and you have to follow this format where you go link ref equals style sheet. Ref here is telling you what we're loading in. And then href is where can we find this style sheet? In this case, it's just file1.css. Obviously, though, change the href to point to your CSS file that actually is in your server, not whatever name I have on my slides here. And then don't forget your trailing slash at the very end there to kind of close the tag out. So syntax, so the way you do it is you have the name of the tag in the very top line, an opening curly brace, typically an enter to make it easier to read, then the instructions, semicolon, instruction, semicolon, then a closing curly brace, exactly like you see here. But that's how you do, and here's how you do every kind of group. If you have a tag group, let's put the name of the tag right there. This is kind of a future thing as well. On my slides, I will always put something in angle brackets like this if I typically intend for you to replace it with something else entirely. So don't put, like, for example, angle bracket H1 angle bracket, put just H1. The angle bracket is just telling you to replace this part of your code with your own replacement values. So for classes, you do a dot, a period, and then the name of the class. Then for IDs, you do a hash symbol and the name of the ID. Other than that, the code is the syntax is the exact same. The same way you can do instructions for all three of them. Opening curly brace, I'm going to put in the middle there, and then a closing curly brace at the very end. So here are some of the most commonly used styling options available in CSS. Color, as the name suggests, is the color of the text. There are a lot of predefined colors like red, blue, green, black, white, light green, orange, you name it. But if you have a very specific color you want to use, you can also use a hex code if you're familiar with how hex code colors work. If not, don't worry about that too much. Background color is the color of the background. Again, you can use any kind of predefined color or your own hex code for color. Font size is the size of the font, typically in px or pixels. Font family is what font you tend to use. Text align is obviously how you align text, right, left, center, justified, something like that. Finally, margin is the margin for, it's kind of how much space is around every element on the page there. Again, always given in values of px. So what is px, first of all? Px stands for pixel, because HTML is a digital structure, digital medium, meaning we display on a screen, and actually every modern screen is made of pixels in rows and columns on your actual display. And so we can define how large or small something is by how many pixels it takes up on any particular display. So demo time. We'll call it demo 2 and open up demo 3. All right, this code looks pretty simple, right? Pretty generic, pretty standard to our typical past demos. But we have some examples, we have some new things here. For one, this link tag, because we're loading in a style sheet located at demo3.css, aka this file right over here. Now, if you look, I have a div with class name. The name here is class example, excuse me. The ID here for this next div is ID example. And I also have this one right here with two classes, class example and class 2. So just like an element can have both an ID and a class, your element can belong to multiple classes. If you need a good mnemonic for it, a good memory device for this, think about you as a person, right? You have a Purdue ID that identifies you and only you, but you also belong to typically 4 classes every semester. Just like that, HTML elements can have an ID that's unique to them and also belong to 1 or more classes, or even 0 if you want to make it like that. So now if you go over to our CSS file here, you can see we have our CSS. We have our H1, which is, we're going to say every H1 tag, no matter what, is always going to be text color blue. We also want to say that our class example, anything with this class example, is going to be 18 pixels, large font-wise, and belong to the sans serif or Helvetica font family. If you don't know what that means, think about like Calibri versus Times New Roman. Calibri rates, which are smoother, no lines, it's called sans serif, and Times New Roman is what's called serif. So it has those fancy lines that kind of make it look older but more fancy, but harder to read on a screen. And then you have also another class, class 2, with a different color background. Then ID example here, where we make it a different background color and give it a text alignment as well. So if we launch this example in our web browser, you can see that all of our H1 tags now became blue, right? Obviously. This first block, if you remember, was I believe the class 1. Yeah, class example right here. And if you look at it, you can see that the font changed from the kind of fancier serif font to a much more smoother, quote unquote, more modern sans serif font. Similarly, our 2 divs, as you can see, right, we had 2 colors, right? The ID and the class 2 turned into yellowish green, kind of ugly color, but why not? And then a regular old background gray. Also, the text became centered. While this page looks kind of bad, you can imagine it's a lot nicer than what you had before, demo 1, demo 2. And if you kind of get really good at CSS, you can make some really cool looking sites like Google Drive or Google or even GitHub, all have very cool CSS properties that can do stuff like this, but on a much larger scale. Okay, were there any questions on demo number 2? No, number 3 here, sorry. Yeah. The text centering? Yeah. So in the CSS file, you can see our ID example, we said text align center. And if you look at HTML, ID example is a middle text block. If you go to it, the middle text block, if I can just close out of some of this, is centered and has a background color of this ugly kind of yellow green color here. That makes sense?
Yeah.
If I instead said like, I believe it's right and left, are the other two options you can choose. And if we just refresh the page, you can see it moves all the way to the right, and then left obviously be the other way as well. Oh, question here. If an element belongs to multiple classes and they contradict each other, what happens? That is a great question. That comes up more than you expect when it comes to big CSS files. So what tends to happen is no one really knows. It's very defined by the browser, but what most browsers tend to do is they'll choose whatever came last, is the most common strategy here. So if you look, right, maybe you want to kind of be special and we'll try that, right? So we have, for example, class example and class 2 on this final div here. Class example sets the, actually we'll put a font background color here as well. Background color, we'll make it red, make it really obvious here. So now this bottom div has both a background color red and a background color gray. And if we refresh, we'll see what happens. It stays gray. Why is that? Because the gray came last in the actual CSS, but the top div became red. If we instead swap them, right, maybe we put this class 2 after, so we just cut that and paste it here. What might happen, I don't actually know if it's going to happen, but yeah, it's red now because the red came last according to the browser. So that's kind of what tends to happen. But again, don't depend on that behavior. The browser can and will do whatever it wants if properties do conflict. So if possible, it's recommended to just make sure that your groupings are defined in such a way that no two groups have conflicting values that can be assigned to the same element. Yeah.
You said an element can only have one ID, but could have multiple classes?
Yes, it can. So if you want, you can also say this, if you can see here, right? We can say this. ID example. Now this is going to be an error because there's two ID examples now, but if you just remove the ID from here. And now if you refresh our page, you can see that every single property that belongs to both the classes and the IDs were applied to this one element right here.
How do you run the error with that?
Yeah, so that won't give you an error. It'll still load fine. The browser won't be very happy with you. There now is two elements with the same ID. But the thing is, IDs are meant to be unique, right? So there have to be, the different rather. So the browser won't actually care, right? Because it'll figure out what you're trying to say and make it no problem whatsoever. Because most modern browsers are pretty good about, trying to fix programming mistakes like that. What will break is code based on that, ID assumption or class assumption, right? Next week, for example, we'll learn how we can use JavaScript to modify elements by IDs or by classes. And what could happen is if you have two IDs or two elements with the same ID, your JavaScript code just break altogether because it expects only one element but got two elements in return, which could break a lot of your code.
Okay, so ID is meant to be like the specific code, the class can be coded many different ways.
Exactly.
Class, whatever, on like a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I could class every single line if I want to. That would be perfectly fine. Actually, you can do that really quick if you want. Like I can put a class up here too, class example. I'm going to remove the ID example to make sure our browser is happy with us. And you can see that it works just fine. Oh, I forgot to put a closing quote there. There we go. Works just fine. It's a horrible color scheme, but it works just fine. That's your question?
Yeah.
Perfect. Any other questions of the demos? Yeah, if you want to figure out what happens, just try it. Your browser will not break. It's pretty good about not doing that. So if you do something that looks wrong, just change it and try again. No harm, no foul. Okay, we're almost done for today. Almost there. Before we get to our checkpoint, we only scratched the absolute surface about CSS. There is so much you can talk about for CSS. Actually, if you go to the link here, I believe it's this one maybe. No, not this one, sorry, the next one. here are all the properties you can use to make your site look nice. As you can see, there are quite a few. Basically, anything you can think of, there is some way to make that work in CSS. It's kind of crazy. And typically what people will end up doing is using a library to do it for them because of how complicated it can be. But in this class, we're going to be doing it ourselves, kind of get the habit of it. But in the real world, very few people write their own CSS. They typically have a library do it for them because of how much there is to do. But if I read more, read these two links. They're very good guides on how to do stuff like that. All right, thank you all for coming today. Please give us some feedback if you have a chance. The link to the forum is right over there. We heavily appreciate it. And if you have questions, we'll be here for checkpoint number 2 for quite a while here. But we will also be on review hours, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Wednesday. I'll put a reminder in Brightspace, or you can ask us right now or on Slack. But basically, your checkpoint for today is going to be using CSS to style the list you made in checkpoint number 1. Now, one thing I want to make sure everyone knows before we head out is that on Brightspace, in the week 1 part of the Brightspace page, there is an assignment called Final Checkpoint Submission. This is a very optional thing. It won't hurt you if you don't do it, but I recommend once you finish your checkpoint number 2 code here, please submit it on that page. Even though we won't grade it for actual points, it's more of kind of helping get feedback. Getting feedback now is extremely important because as we move forward into the project, we want to make sure everyone knows exactly what they're working on, what they're doing, so that everyone has the best chance to succeed in 5 or 6 weeks from now. So the submission box is open until like the end of April, so whenever you have a chance, but it is quote unquote due before next class. So, but again, turn in late, I do not care. I'll get back to you in a couple hours, couple days, hopefully. But please, once you finish your code here today, please submit it for a quote unquote grade before next class begins. With that in mind, thank you all for coming. I will be here in person for the next 45 minutes or so to answer questions. But thank you all. Have a good day.